final ready? I hope that by the end of this debate, Team Singapore can explore the streets of Panama, because while it's true that they can claim the more general popularity for their platforms, they don't realize that accessibility is a foundation to unlock their case and to make sure to provide equal education and basic necessities for the most critical years of your life. That not only includes the richer population who would like to prefer Google Classroom, but most importantly, the poorest and most vulnerable students whose access to this is the difference between working and being a first-generation college student. Panel, as much as you care for them, that is the reason why Team Mexico is already winning by a landslide. I want to first get into 3 points of setup before going to our first 2 arguments. Firstly, what does our education tech look like? A, platforms that help teachers impact with students digitally and interact with them, assigning homework and keeping track of class performance overall. B, online resources that contain the information, such as textbooks, but presented also with with videos, AI assistants, and targeted question banks to help students digest the information. And C, resources for teachers to explain education topics, make worksheets, among other teaching techniques. Note, since the pandemic tech development has exploded and experienced a huge tech boom, this means that the tech is increasingly becoming an advantageous tool for students. Secondly, public interest models for tech are A, built by nonprofits, universities, and governments, either independently or in collaboration with each other, and B, they're funded by public actors or private nonprofits. Comparatively, venture-backed models are based on funding venture capitalists that solely care about getting profit and competing against other tech developers. Thirdly, our stance, judges, and simple. Our stance is that we get better development, and it is crucially viable when it is in the moment that it's accessible. First argument then on how we get better development. The premise here is simple. We get better development under our side of the house because we have better incentive and more capacity. First, I want to focus on incentives, and then the second part of this argument will focus on capacity. On incentives, we have 4 different mechanisms. Firstly, university, government, and NGOs benefit from smarter populations. Their goal is to provide good education for all because 1, educated population can get higher paying jobs and stimulate the economy. Secondly, educates people into voting, which helps the government as well. And comparatively, the goal of private companies is to get as many investors and profits as possible so they can build okay platforms as long as they have good marketing and branding to get investors and shareholders. Look, these platforms like OutSchool, the only thing that they do is that they get teachers to make like groups with other students so that they can teach for like classes that they're interested in. But I don't get why it's so important to get these investors to only like spend money on the solely thing that they're going to do, which is like Zoom meetings. I don't think like they can claim like any like development on their side or how these like platforms are going to be extremely advanced when these like mechanisms that they have are really basic. But secondly, public interest models are likely to have long-term investments. For example, a political party that reforms education can build a legacy that supports future electoral campaigns. And universities care about receiving the best students as well, which makes them more competitive in the long term. Comparatively, venture-backed models prioritize quick return on investments, and they don't have capacity to do long-term planning because economies and the demands change constantly. Thirdly, public interest models are more likely to prioritize collaboration because they have no incentive to compete with other NGOs. So then when tech is developed, and it's then like shared with others, and we have better incentives then, because comparatively, venture-backed models need to compete with others and will not share their discoveries. This is inherently bad because firstly, with that competition, you then prioritize keeping the information to yourself, and so therefore the main priority is making money. But if you don't have the main priority to help students and to invest them and to not share information with other different platforms and companies to see how they can improve theirs, that is not inherently good for education. I'll take you after my first argument, and not helping these students achieve the best that they can. Fourthly, individuals who work in public tech sectors are highly qualified, and they could have like probably worked in the private one with high salaries. But what that means on our side is that they likely have altruistic incentives, and that every return will choose the option that makes like a positive impact on their country and the kids that they most care about. Bottom line, the type of development we get on our side of the house would be better because it will put good education and its very best quality in the front line, rather than funding the next vacation for a venture capitalist. Secondly, I want to focus on capacity. No, thank you. Public interest models have high-skilled workers and funding capacity for development. This is true because of 5 independent different reasons. Firstly, they use the individuals from universities to better know how information is taught and how information can be best digested into students. This collaboration is better because you can access different skill sets and allocate the development of tech rather than to the knowledge that we already have from the very best professors, from the very best nonprofit leaders, and the very best people who have the very best incentives for these students. Secondly, because governments often have a big burden for education and they can cross-subsidize from other sectors, we can get more funding. This means that, and the implication of this is that the investment for longer periods of time with no financial return is a necessity. And this is why the internet was literally created thanks to the projects that the government funded themselves. For example, AppNet was a prototype for the internet we use for today because of funding from the government. Thirdly, we have less production costs because they don't have to hire experts because we already have them. Fourthly, public donations. For example, in UNICEF, there are billions of people that donate to them, and therefore you can get more people on board easily because of an altruistic cause. And as soon as this is an altruistic cause, the buy-in and the donations will be better and a more larger quantity on our side. But fifthly, we also gain more collaboration with I already explained to you sooner. Ultimately, we get better education development that aims to target issues in higher quality education ed techs that are tailored to the needs of the country's specific education models, such as how India's program aims to give equal grounds to those who are taking the India national exam. Sure, I'll take you.
Your points are deeply uncomparative. A good educational outcome comes from a good product, which companies, as you identify with competitive incentives, uniquely want to do better.
And those products that you get to gain good education is from the best professors, from the best universities that you can have. The only good actor that you have is investors, but their incentives are superficial. They want to get money, but we have the best actors because they can fund the best resources. Second argument then on accessibility. Why is it that the government's duty to provide its citizens with this platform? Governments have a duty to uphold the natural rights of citizens for citizens for freedom and self-defense. Therefore, individuals agree for these rights to be restricted to an extent to ensure they receive benefits back. Therefore, we have material benefits on our side, and therefore we control the government in return, such as voting. Therefore, using this analysis, in the case of education, individuals pay taxes to fund public education in the development of better curriculums and better teacher salaries. And therefore, on our side, there's an expectation and there's a fulfillment, most importantly, for an education high quality in return for their children who go to school in public schools. This duty is not fulfilled in opposition because, firstly, ed tech is becoming a core aspect that puts on rich individuals far ahead from others, and the government's duty applies to every single citizen in the country. Without accessible ed tech, the government doesn't fulfill their duty. And secondly, if ed tech has issues, citizens can hold government accountable directly through votes and courts. Five mechanisms then. Firstly, we have market growth because this benefits their country and the economy the moment that they're taught the best, and therefore they can stimulate the economy with the best skills that they have. Second, we have fulfillment because we have capable individuals who are likely to get better jobs and enjoy learning, and therefore they gain more fulfillment. And thirdly, we reduce inequality as well. The other two impacts and mechanisms will be addressed in my second speaker. You weigh this so heavily because of scope and volume, because more people on our side have more access to this ed tech simply because it's free. And even if the venture-backed models have an insanely low cost, this will represent a barrier for entry, because then less people can access this. This is relevant because this fulfills better the purpose of ed tech, and that is why you vote Team Mexico by a landslide. Thank you.
Thanks so much. First up. Just a note, I do have a timekeeper. I guess I will have it to keep 1, 7, and 8 minutes. Unless you really want me to, just it will help everyone keep track of time better.
Sure, that's fine. All's good? So, everyone has an impression that Singapore is a very rich country with a great education system, and we're not denying it. But what we have to confide is the one time when Singapore tried to engage in the public interest model, the product we ended up was this thing called MC Online, which, for your information, looked like something out of a 1990s IBM computer, which is why we had to replace it with private firms like Hubitz and Outschool. The problem is that this proposition team gives many reasons, but all of the reasons are not grounded in reality. They give many reasons to prove why governments plausibly can have good incentives, but they give no reason why a government which per their own framing is extremely cash-strapped will be able to invest that money in the economy. In setup, we prefer venture-backed models of development in education technology for primary and secondary schools. What do venture-backed models look like? We agree they mostly want to maximize monetary incentives, but it's unclear as to why this monetary incentive is as evil and scheming as what they like. They want to innovate to become better because per their own framing there's lots of monetary competition, which is why they want to push down prices in our world. Moreover, they want to cater to a large variety of individuals because that is how you delineate yourself from competition. Crucially, in our worst case scenario, the government can still subsidize the ultimate service provided by the venture-backed models. This is likely going to be cheaper than in their world because, as I will prove later, the R&D cost is going to be extremely high. So if government incentive on both sides is symmetric, on our side we actually save government money whilst ensuring access. Secondly, what does public interest models look like? These look like things funded by non-profit organizations which we will prove structurally have very little budgets. But the important thing to note here is that generally these actors are guaranteed contracts, which means they're generally insulated from market competition. Moving to responses, the first thing I want to take out is their preamble, where they champion this idea of vulnerability. I suppose the subterranean logic is they're saying that, we don't need sophisticated education models. In that case, government investment in these models is a terrible idea, because instead you could redirect money into things which are far more primary, like textbooks, like actually ensuring that the school has proper infrastructure. So I just want to take out that linguistic push coming from their side. This debate is very much about the quality of these services. But let's scrutinize the first argument. The first thing I want to know on better development is that their incentive analysis is not comparative. They say that governments want to develop good artificial intelligence services. Like, why won't private companies also want to do the same thing? They say governments really want to champion it towards the individuals. Why won't companies, which is profit maximizing, want to ensure they capture the maximum market size by also appealing to individuals as well? Their assertion that governments are long-termists is just not true, because governments are of course bounded by the vote, which means that necessarily short-termists. Third, they talk about this idea of collaborations. There is no incentive for governments to collaborate with other governments, because then the other governments will be able to claim the rewards for this. Comparatively, in our side, companies do want to collaborate because that is how you maximize your capture of the market share. Their assertion they just pay the universities more so the universities will get more researchers. This is just hilarious because it's not the university students making the programs. It comes out to the capacity of your actual ability to innovate. On ability, they really didn't want to touch on this ability idea. They lots of incentives with no ability analysis. Their only assertion is that we can have experts in our world as well. Like, why? You need to pay the experts. We'll prove in an argument why you can't pay the experts. Their second argument is frankly laughable. One, it's contingent obviously on the practical to what extent it is effective, but if you take the argument to the logical end, it's basically saying we should ban all private sectors, which presumably is not a burden they're willing to take. The reason this is so is because we accept at some times, even though we pay taxes to the government, when government incentives are inefficient or harmful at best, we will default to private actors. We're unclear why that's harmful. First argument on my side, why we uniquely create a far more effective learning platform for children. The premise of this argument is that public investment models are likely to be poor for a few reasons. One, public interest models are led by organizations without sufficient resources to innovate well. This is because they face budget crunches. Governments face deficits when they have other competing incentives on the ballot box like healthcare and the economy. Universities have to ensure education for their own students, so they're unlikely going to have lots of money for this. Even for things like NGOs, which rely on donations oftentimes fluctuate, which means the amount of capital they have is bad. This is an acute problem because the research cost towards things like education models is costly, where you have to do things like user testing and algorithmic optimization, which oftentimes is not a cheap thing. Comparatively, private investments have lots of capital. The reason is because PE firms want to go into high-risk areas to maximize their own growth, which is why they're likely going to inject capital and invest heavily into these nations. The second reason is that even if the models on their side do not face budget crunches, the issue is that many of these organizations have extremely bloated bureaucracies. For example, in NGOs, you need to run layers of checks to make sure that every single cent is spent properly. You need to justify why your you're spending on this very service and not alternative services. For the government, they are oftentimes unwilling to fire, for example, ineffective bureaucrats, because that is optically bad and sends a poor message towards the market. Comparatively, firms are uniquely motivated by profit incentive. On proposition, they have no competition because oftentimes it's the government themselves developing these systems which means they're insulated from competition. Comparatively, in our world, per the wording of the motion, there are startups, which means the barrier of entry to enter is low. This means companies compete with each other and lower prices. The upshot of this argument is that public interest models are poor, whereas venture-backed models are significantly better. What does this look like on a tangible level? They cannot trade off this idea of innovation because in the status quo, attention spans are dropping. Children are choosing to play video games and disengage from lessons. This is an literally existential issue of education. In our world, apps like Qubits and Gamify give you math in a gamified version where you can complete things like missions with stories and make students engage. Comparatively, the deficient state development on their side are likely going to be extremely rudimentary and boring. For example, After School, which is a platform developed by Thailand, literally looks like Google Forms. No student is ever going to be engaged on that. But secondly, we better cater to students' differing needs because on our side, models can have sophisticated algorithmic measures to make sure they cater to each student's needs. Comparatively, the rudimentary models are likely going to arise in their world is harmful. What I have proven is that we fundamentally achieve the goals of education far better, which means we already win. Before the second argument, yes.
R&D for health can be costly, so you would support that government's providing support to this sector too?
No. We don't want the government to do the R&D. At worst, they can subsidize the final product, but we're willing to bite the bullet. Second argument, why we actually increase access, flipping the argument. The premise is that on proposition, they retrograde access towards the most vulnerable. The first is because the poor actually have very little voting power. Oftentimes they work long hours, they're extremely busy, and they do not turn up to the ballot box, which is why half of the people living in poverty in India did not show up for elections. Crucially, what governments would do is they're only going to develop the services which cater towards the richest, because those are the people with most lobbying power over them. They will choose not to set up servers in areas which are impoverished because they know that those areas will not be able to win them the election. Comparatively, companies can engage in price discrimination. The reason this is so is because generally when you do private equity, you want to expand your market share. The best way to consolidate market share to eliminate competition is by capturing all possible users of a populace. They can price discriminate because you can prevent arbitrage in this instance by giving, for example, different login credentials to people in different socioeconomic statuses. Two, we actually help poorer students. That flips their point because we free up value to what poorer schools actually need. Because instead of developing sophisticated AI algorithms which is on their side, we can free up capital to build science labs, to subsidize textbooks and stationery in rural Ghana, because those are the things which far more actualize education compared to the tertiary needs on their side. This is because we have another actor taking on the cost of research and development, which we prove we get better access. Even at worst, on our side, the government can still subsidize the final service. The reason this is likely is because the costs are going to be significantly lower. That is why in Thailand, education and healthcare is subsidized, but the government does not engage in the production of that in the worst case. The bottom line is, on our side, the quality of education is far better actualized. For all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Thanks so much. Chupi.
Panel, thus far in the debate, side opposition only proves that in their side of the house, the quality of education and quality of these edtech models will be better. Even if they prove to the fullest extent and you buy all of their claims, it's still not enough for them to win the debate. Because the purpose of these edtech models is not to improve the quality of education for itself, but it is to reduce the inequality within education, which is why accessibility is the clear path to the ballot, which they have failed to fulfill, which is why I'm so proud to propose. I want to do a couple of things in this speech. Firstly, rebuttals. Firstly on, and then first class on who gets better development, and secondly on how there's more accessibility, which is the most important issue in this debate. Having that said, let's talk about the few claims that they give. Claim number one, they say that there's no reason why monetary incentive is bad and why that's going to be worse, right? I have three responses. Number one, the private companies only have an incentive to cater to those who can only afford. So they have an incentive to expand their market share, but that is only when the market itself is profitable. In the moment where the market isn't profitable, where the companies can realize that they don't get profit from that market, there's no reason to expand the market to these individuals as well, right? But second of all, we told you that in competition, we told you that in terms of like competition, there's an incentive for them to increase the prices because now they also have to like, when there's like a contract between government and private companies, there's so many individuals so that now the companies have an active incentive to increase their prices so that they can have more profit from the government, right? But thirdly, we told you that subsidization is mostly relied on lobbying and etc. Because no, the vast majority of cases in terms of like how government subsidizes with private companies is that these private companies lobby those governments so that these governments pick specific companies that is not necessarily have the best model, but because like these companies lobby and like have like best connections with the government the most. Let's talk about this term on collaboration because they say that collaboration is going to be happening better in their side of the house. First of all, that's like a total contradiction on their case, right? Because they said that private companies have competition and they care about competition. That is precisely the reason why they won't share because they have a competition incentive to create the best model itself. So there's no reason why they would share these because they want to keep the best model to themselves. But second of all, we told you that governments and NGOs have a common incentive to share and develop these models because now under our side of the house, these governments and NGOs have a common incentive to create the best educational model, which is the reason why they would have an incentive to collaborate and share the information that would make the better model. Well, let's move on to the second claim on how public interest models are poorly developed. First of all, we told you that from manual, there are specific budgets that are designated for educational models. So for instance, in all nations and in all governments, there's specific budgets that are designed, which allows these individuals and allows these governments to create their own programs. But second of all, we told you that now governments can cross-subsidize from other areas of profits. So for instance, insofar as the government is a really large party, they can gain profit from other areas and cross-subsidize that to missing links such as education models, which makes this possible. But also, the other claim that comes up is bureaucracy and how that's going to happen under our side of the house. First of all, we told you that governments also have bureaucracy, but second of all, we told you that the barriers are low. That is not true because they have a certain portion of the market to win. Having that said, I'll take the point of information.
So you are worried about companies lobbying the government, which causes inefficiencies, but isn't your model literally letting the government develop the thing?
Yeah, but like your point is that, well, in your side of the house, it's going to be the best model. I say that is not true because companies rely and lobby the companies. So instead of having the best model, it becomes about competition on which side lobbies and which side has more connections to the government. That's the comparative that you have to engage in. But the second thing is the second argument that they give is ridiculous, which is that poor have low voting power. First of all, I think this is simply not true, right? Like in countries such as Latin America and whatnot, there's sufficient political power from the poor as well. That is precisely the reason why, for instance, in countries such as India or in countries such as Mexico, there are already built-in education models because the poor demands it. So I think that's empirically false. But second of all, we told you that we told you that they also mentioned about this term on market share. You can cross-apply my response on how market share only happens, expanding the market share only happens when the market itself is profitable. Insofar as these companies already know that it's not going to be profitable when they engage with these low portions, then they're not going to do that. So that is precisely the reason why certain companies will not create education models for Ghana. I don't think why. I don't get how that was practical. But having that said, let's move on to two things. Firstly, on better development, we told you that we proved two things in this clash. Number one, we told you that there's better incentives on our side. There's three main reasons why that's true. Number one, governments have structural incentives to educate to the best of the citizens. So they already know that these citizens are going to be future leaders and they're going to be future developers, which is the reason why they have an incentive to provide the best. But second of all, we told you that people have active incentives to enhance education and tailor better to their population because they made an active choice to do so. So for instance, individuals could have gone to private sectors, but the reason why they have stayed in the government infrastructures and they have stayed in NGOs and whatnot is precisely because they have altruistic incentives and incentives to improve the educational model that they have. But thirdly, we told you that these governments do not focus on maximizing profits, and this is important because it is a new material. We told you that oftentimes private ones have things such as making you to pay more to unlock certain features or making you to pay more to unlock better quality education. Insofar as that's true, what they solve is not inequality, but they increase the inequality of education, because now you have to literally pay. But second of all, we've also told you that there's better capacity in our side. Because firstly, there's increased funding in our side of the house. But second of all, we told you that public donations are sufficient enough because it expands the markets to those who can't. But thirdly, we've told you that these are generally better actors. Like for instance, you literally have university professors. You literally have experts for each area which contribute to this. The overall premise here and the conclusion here is that at best, the amount of development and the quality of educational models is going to be pretty symmetric in both sides of the house. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, I want to talk about how we get better accessibility, which is the path to the ballot that you have to vote panel. Firstly, we told you that we get better accessibility of education on our side. These are the reasons are threefold. Number one, there's lower entry costs because governments can now cross-subsidize it and use it, and they also have sufficient funding because their main objective isn't to guarantee profits, so they don't have to artificially increase their prices to gain the profit. But second of all, we told you that it creates programs that are tailored to their own needs and things that are more essential to the curriculum. Like quite literally, what kind of company would create an educational model that would be tailored to the education system of Ghana or education system of Ecuador? That was extremely unclear. The only actors that could do this are the governments of Ecuador and governments of Ghana. But third of all, we told you that there's a direct use of schools because the entry barrier is low. So insofar as that's true, it is extremely easy for the government to implement those programs in their school. And also note the vast majority of individuals don't even know that these platforms exist. And the moment where they get to know that these platforms exist is when they get exposed to this in things such as schools or in things such as public platforms. The overall comparative here is that in their side of the house, there's going to be higher fees to enter, which means that they're going to exclude people who are in the bottom of the line. But second of all, it doesn't solve inequality, but it expands inequality. Because now in their side of the house, there are certain features such as now you have to pay for certain better features or better quality education, which means that the inequality gap is going to be far worse than their side. And here's the reason why you have to weigh this argument more than anything else in this round. Because first of all, there's more scale and scope. Because we reach to more individuals, and we are the only ones who cater to these most vulnerable individuals. But second of all, we told you that these are life-changing. Like quite literally in developing nations such as Mexico, in public schools, there are 50 kids in one classroom with one teacher. These education models are the only available alternative that these individuals have that they can access. So insofar as that's true, the weighing here is simple. You have to weigh to the most vulnerable individuals, which we only cater, and they have failed to respond. But third of all, we told you that this is a prerequisite for any of their impacts in the very first place. Because in order to get the impacts of education, you have to first access and reach to the largest audience and the most vulnerable ones in the very first place, where it's going to be the place where the most impact happens in this debate. Overall, panel, accessibility is the only key, and that's the only way to win this debate. We prove that. This is a clear battle for Team Mexico. Do not be afraid. Eliminate Singapore.
Thanks so much. Also shift to a place that Grade 2 of
I believe that Team Mexico was unfortunately slightly misguided by no fault of their own during the start of this debate, because it seems like a Harry Potter waved a wand during their set to hire the country's best experts in tech who would probably rather work in top tech firms because these experts are somehow motivated by a fiery sense of nationalism and altruism. Guys, the people who work in UNICEF are different from the people who code technology. So you cannot claim that these people are motivated by this fiery sense of altruism. Just to be clear, these people are motivated by money. So if you work in a government which underpays you because the government is facing a deficit, because the government needs to fund things like healthcare, as Xi Cheng points out, that means that no one codes the AI on your side of the house. It means you don't even have the resources to collaborate because there isn't anyone willing to code the platform, so you don't get the platform on your side of the house. That is by far the clearest impact in this debate. 2 questions in this speech. First on access, second on innovation. First question on access. I want to talk about 2 things under this. The first thing we'll talk about is, do they actually get more access? Second, even if they get more access, why is it at best not exclusive in this debate? 1. Do they actually get more access? They give us 2 broad mechanisms for this. The first is that governments want good educational outcomes. The obvious issue is companies also want good educational outcomes, because if you do not give good educational outcomes, it means the government is not going to take your contract. It means the government will be voted out, because maybe even if lobbying money exists, the point is voters didn't actually get the good education that they wanted, so parents are pissed and parents vote the government out. But more importantly, companies themselves want to give good outcomes because they don't want to be outcompeted by other companies. Their own analysis infers that says that the startup market is very saturated and there are many companies. Coding AI helps us because it means that companies will be outcompeted by other companies. That proves you have an incentive to give a good educational platform that caters to people. The second response that they give us is they say they get collaboration on their side by various organizations like UNICEF and the government. Obviously, they don't get this on their side of the house, and the reason for that is because these organizations don't want to collaborate. A government in one country does not want to collaborate with the government of another country because they themselves point out that each country wants to maximize their own workforce and not help other people. But more than that, UNICEF has no ability to coordinate this information. A lot of the development is done by governments themselves because that is where the experts are concentrated. UNICEF cannot collaborate on this information because it cannot take information from one government and forcibly give it to another government, meaning that their analysis on collaboration at best is symmetric, if not worse, on their side of the house because they give governments the maximal ability to control all of the innovation. But third, on a very worst case, this is just not an exclusive impact. We can also mandate things like tax sharing and profit tax sharing between various companies because these things aren't patented, as they themselves point out, because the AI industry is so saturated. This crucially does not cross the house because what we point out is we still would rather companies do this. What we will mandate is that companies share the information when doing this. So on a very worst case, it can be done on our side. Conversely, what is the positive material we give you on this? The first thing we tell you is that we free up money for how to actually help poorer schools. It is not just about price discrimination to build the platforms that poor school needs. It's that the fact that what poor schools need is not these platforms, but actually having teachers. So on their own example, where they say 50 students to 1 teacher means that teachers are overworked, we flip that because we increase the amount of money the school has to hire more teachers on our side, rather than directing the money towards developing this platform, of which the benefits are only concentrated to the rich. Second, their response to price discrimination is really flippant. They say you don't want to do that because these people cannot give money. Obviously, this misses basic economics 101. The way price discrimination works is you are able to recoup profits because the poor form a significant base, as they themselves point out. Therefore, no thanks, you give them lower prices, but the large voter base and the large base of the poor people offsets for the lower prices at which you sell the product to them. But second, even on a very worst case where you actively make a loss from selling to poor people, PE firms have an incentive to do this because the way PE firms work is they go to risky places and they make risky investments because they look for very high returns. So at the end of the day, even if you make a loss, no thanks, the PE firm actually has a lot of profit to offset the loss that they make, meaning they have an incentive to price discriminate on our side. Therefore, at the end of this, all of our analysis on access is untouched. It is a bit late for property to deal with it. Second, even if they get more access on their side of the house, why is this at best not an exclusive impact? The key mechanism that they don't do with Xi Cheng no thanks is that we can subsidize this. That even if firms are the ones who sell this to governments can subsidize the rate at which they sell this to schools. This is important because this is the way we currently do with many things in healthcare, which proves there is a possible impact. So at best, all of their analysis and their third argument is symmetric in this debate. Second question in this speech then, what happens to innovation? Before that, I can actually take a POI.
In your sort of house, you have a higher burden and it's going to be far more expensive because now you have to hire hundreds of teachers, and you have to rewrite curriculums, and also make new educational models. How is that going to happen?
I don't have to hire hundreds of teachers. We gave you the flip in Xi Cheng. You don't respond, so respond. Second question then on innovation. The first thing I want to talk about is, do they actually have the ability to innovate on their side of the house? The broad response that we get from both speakers is that they can innovate because cross-subsidization exists. Obviously, governments are unable to cross-subsidize because this mechanism is hinged upon voters allowing governments to redirect the funds to begin with. The issue is that education is not often the top voting priority of voters. Voters often care about many other things. For example, things like healthcare. For example, things like the economy. This analysis is important because it proves that they don't have the money to redirect on their side to begin with. But second, I want to flip their argument. The reason why governments are not willing to engage in things like cross-subsidization is because it's a very risky endeavor, and governments are often very risk-averse because the party does not want to take up the cost of being the one that messed up in government when engaging in this cross-subsidization, but then taking on the cost of the R&D failing. Comparatively, companies are more likely to engage in this because they have a lot of other profits to offset this. This is a PE firm which is backed by large companies like Blackstone and KKR, so they do have the necessary funds to offset a failed cross-subsidization, but governments do not do that. Therefore, it is a clear win on the ability to innovate on our side. Second, I want to talk about the incentive to innovate. The broad response we get to our mechanism of competition is they say competition means that you will increase prices. Obviously, this fails basic economics because when you have more firms, it means the prices is pushed down because firms want to be more efficient because they want to outcompete one another to decrease the prices at which they sell this to the government, so we do get low prices on our side of the house. Why then are we willing to trade off quality for access in this debate? And here's where I transition to my third argument as well. The first reason is that it is far more logically prior. A better fully developed product is what actually incentivizes more people to get government subsidize this product because it is worth the money of subsidizing. Comparatively, on that side of the house, people are not willing to fund education because people realize that the experts are not working in education to develop these models to begin with. So people say that we should not save the education system and we should let the teachers continue being overworked on their side. The second reason for why this is true is it is far more vulnerable and exclusive impact on our side of the house. If governments have good incentives, they can subsidize this model symmetrically on both sides. Uniquely, what we do is we free up resources for more vulnerable needs that schools need. For example, crumbling schools in poor neighborhoods don't need a fancy AI model. What they do need is ensuring they have more teachers and more textbooks, and that is the money they will fill up for on our side of the house. But the third reason is that on vulnerability, it actually falls to us because the better quality of education technology on our side leads to catering to more diverse student needs. It is not just about the super poor students, which unfortunately by the end of this debate, we think might be a wash because these people don't have the resources to access the education platform regardless because they don't have access to stable internet connections. For example, what it is about vulnerable students who are slower in learning, vulnerable students who have learning and intellectual disabilities. On our side, when you develop the platform better, that's when you have more investor money to cater to different student needs, so that's when these people are protected better on our side of the house. Therefore, at the end of this debate, even if middle class kids must pay more for this, it's fine because they have many other alternatives. It is for the most vulnerable that we free up resources for because they get their learning needs catered for.
The development of educational technology is not space exploration. It is simply the development of coding and on applications that don't require as much development and as much investment as opposition characterizes. The moment they lose this debate is when they don't prove to you that development is as significant, and third up is way too late to respond to what Manuela tells you from first. So first, on development, the first question I want to ask is how much development is actually necessary to provide a quality education? Manuela tells you that it's not like this complex thing. It's just websites with video call features, small games, and comprehensive videos that are very easy to access in the status quo. Maybe 20 years ago, their case was actually relevant when there wasn't enough technology education, technology development. However, right now, I think that generally governments have enough access to like information on how coding works in order to be able to provide these services in the first place. I think that we sufficiently prove that we continue development because we actually are able to like continue a sufficient amount of funding so that development continues. And we don't see why the tipping point is having this insane more funding from venture capitalists. Ultimately, what does this do to the round? If you buy that Singapore has more money for research and development, it is not enough for them to win this clash. And their rhetoric supports this. Thus far, the only issues that they point out on government platforms is that they look like an ugly 90s computer or like a Google form. However, when has aesthetics become the key component as to how you prioritize educational development? I think that, yes, at some times they can be more engaging for little kids. However, we believe that it is likely that these develop over time. Because sure, we might not get them this year as they would under their side of the house, but maybe in 5 years, kids actually have access to like these more engaging games, and we don't see why this is necessarily worse. But more importantly, we think that the moment in which this is simply a luxury, because the most important thing is access, and that is a prerequisite to even having like these quality type of games. Because in the status quo, the vast majority of children in public education cannot access these platforms because they have to pay thousands to get access to them for just a single year. Under our side of the house, even if they're less developed to a small extent, we think that they're still sufficiently good enough for them to actually understand the curriculum more in depth, for teachers to actually have more resources to educate their children, and for students to actually be able to balance out the scales overall. They tell you that governments do not have the capacity to fund these types of things because, first of all, vulnerable individuals don't have voting power. I think that, as Brendan claimed, this is already an assertion. But let's say that it's true. We believe that parties, in this case, have more incentives to draw these types of individuals to the ballot. This is because the moment in which they show that they care about the children, if you show up, if they tell them that, like, if they're giving good educational programs to these individuals, they tell them that if you show up to the ballot and vote for this party, you can now win more of this and get more of these benefits. I think that is precisely why so many Latin American countries have gone on leftist parties, because the moment in which these leftist parties cater to poorer individuals, they're actually able to draw in a new subset of the population that wasn't voting before and that will necessarily be loyal voters towards them. So they do have voter incentives in these cases. Then secondly, they tell you that what happens is that they free up value to what, they tell you that they free up value to what other schools actually need. However, we think that this requires a lot more money to create change on opposition. They tell you that they will build schools, that they will hire teachers, that they will rewrite entire curriculums. However, it is unlikely that they are able to do this for every single school, because note that the impacts that they access are simply things that happen school by school and like region by region. Under our side of the house, the moment in which we successfully create a single platform, I think that the entirety of the country can actually access this as long as they have like a viable computer at home. The moment in which we're able to create this program, this doesn't just like support the schools that we're already going to get the most funding under their side of the house because they're the ones that they care more about electorally, but also it helps in general. Now, going back to this idea that vulnerable individuals don't have power, I also want to break a characterization that they have that they have fled to under their side of the house. Under your side of the house, it's not just governments, but it's also NGOs. It is also universities. It is also these big, amazing actors that are actually able to fund these types of things. I think intuitively, UNICEF has thousands of money in the bank, and even if like donations fluctuate eventually, I think that they're big enough to actually not have a risk from this. And also, I think that they have like already set up plans so that donations happen like recurringly. Oftentimes, when you sign up to donate for UNICEF, you sign up to donate for an entire year to ensure that there's more stability. So you will get donations from all of these types of things. Now, the second speaker also tells you that that comparatively companies will cater to a wide scope of students because they're actually able to like get more consumers in this way. I think their second already symmetrizes this enough by conceding that these other students will not be catered to by companies, so it is no longer something that you can vote on. Now, let's talk about our constructive material. We tell you that first of all, we get better workers under our side of the house. The response on opposition is that no one will work in these areas at all. However, I think that it's very clear that that is not the case. There are hundreds of workers in UNICEF. There are hundreds of workers in the government that are top minds. Our claim was not that there will be like amazing individuals, just that like they're often like good enough and they do have the choice to work between like private companies and public ones. And the fact that they choose to work in the public sector means that they're actually have altruistic incentives and care about the benefit of the population and of the citizens. This is particularly important in the tech sector because I think that any individual who has the ability to code in the status quo is highly demanded by through different companies. So the moment in which they choose to work in the public sector, they do have altruistic incentives. This never actually engaged with our claim. Secondly, on long-term interests, Secondly, on long-term interests, they try to claim that parties are bound by votes. Although this is a great stock debate argument, it didn't engage with our nuance. What we tell you is that parties care about long-term reputation building, that the moment in which they're able to provide citizens with good education, they're able to use that in the following elections as well. It's not just something that goes like candidate by candidate, but as a party as a whole, and when they're able to reap these benefits. Then they try to tell us that there will be more collaboration under their side of the house. However, they also tell us that they will be competing with other individuals. So I think that this just like cancels itself out. Ultimately, I think that you were able to buy our constructive on why governments will have sufficient enough money to actually continue development under our side of the house. Ultimately, the impact of this clash is that development is possible and that it's better under our side of the house when they actually cater to students rather than investors. Because what students care about is actually being able to get into universities. When the government sees that this program is succeeding, it is because education is actually getting better. When they succeed, it's simply because they get more money in the pockets of venture capitalists. Yes.
Do you think that winning the election is the prerequisite for the government to actualize the desires of long-term development?
Thank you. I don't think that's necessarily true because parties do want to build a legacy, but also it's not just about governments, it's also about NGOs such as UNICEF or such as other educational institutions that do care about continuously getting funding like from the UN or from like bigger actors that are funding them in the status quo and from like giving back to like these donors and explaining that they have actually been able to succeed, which is also another accountability metric for them. So ultimately, I think that what is most important in this clash is that we get sufficient development and that their like marginal change on the amount of development that they get won't actually be impactful to the quality of education that individuals receive under our side of the house. So ultimately, you cannot vote for them on this clash. Now, I want to talk about the second clash on accountability, where we are clearly winning on. I think that it's very clear that accountability is better under our side of the house because of the lack of responsiveness. I think that first, we bring to you an argument on access, where we explain that we're actually able, like governments are actually have a duty to give accessibility, and that it is their principal responsibility to do so. And also because the way that they can actually listen to the demands of populations. Moreover, we tell you that we get more access on more accessibility under our side of the house because the government covers the cost and because they have incentives to do it. I think that this clashes with their material on accessibility because they tell you that vulnerable individuals don't actually have voting power on their side of the house. But here, I think you can cross-apply this analysis. Moreover, their whole responses on accessibility rely on the claim that we will not be able to make the access to this actually cheap. I think that here is when I respond to their first argument, where they tell you that there are competing goals, so capital will be spread out, and there likely won't be enough money to like invest into these types of things. However, I think that in the status quo, there's already capital spread out between different goals. However, governments have well-planned budgets that actually like allow them to allocate enough money for education. So I don't see why this is the case. Secondly, they tell you that the donations will fluctuate. However, I already explained to you that there are often subscription plans and that NGOs are big enough to avoid harms. Ultimately, if you analyze the responses they get given to our argument on access, this wasn't actually the case. How do we get better access? I think that first, we actually care about reaching a vast amount of the population, because under their side of the house, it's very likely that these companies care about only reaching a small minority of individuals and charging them a really high cost. Why is this so damning? Because it does not balance the scales on access to higher education. The moment in which individuals have to take the same state exam for access to a university, those who come from private schools that already have better education and can access these types of things will have an advantage. Thank you.
You know that team is sliding when they give a very, very weird preamble at the top of that Prop 3. She says that you don't need EdTech in the status quo. I want to be clear about the two implications of this on their case. First, this is literally the model they have to stand for, because public interest models are ones where the government chooses to develop that technology by themselves. All of the reasons they give for why the ability comes from the fact that governments have presumably smart people means that they are the ones developing. Comparatively on our side, it is not about governments funding private investors. It is about private investors coming in by themselves, because often education is an untapped market that private equity firms are deeply interested in. The second implication on their case is that this cuts into their case, because the way in which they respond to Rupa's weighing about what matters towards the poorer communities being the fact that you fix crumbling school infrastructure, for example, rather than guaranteeing edtech, is them saying that you don't need textbooks because you get this kind of edtech. So this cuts them because the contradiction on their side is that they have not picked whether or not they want governments to engage in edtech to begin with. Before I go any further, I just want to point out that the second argument, which was a pseudo principle, is entirely hung on them proving that they get the technology to begin with. Because if there is no good technology, then there's nothing for you to increase accessibility to. Two questions then. First on quality and second on access. First on quality, I want to talk about three things. First, do they get the ability to innovate? Second, do they get the incentive to innovate? And finally, I want to weigh ability over incentive. First, on ability. And I just want to point out that the strategy of this prop is to give us mitigation galore, right? They say, oh, universities are smart, you get cross-subsidized by governments, that there's somehow collaboration to be gotten. I want to point out the new things that stuck out in Prop 3. The first thing she says is in terms of collaborations. If collaboration increases the quality of that product, presumably on our side, governments can mandate this, right? The ability for you to collaborate on certain base forms of technology oftentimes increases competitiveness, which is why companies oftentimes are willing to do this, right? You see parallel fields like pharmaceuticals, for example, where Pfizer is able to collaborate with other big kinds of pharma companies in order to ensure that the final products they get out of it are more competitive. Next, she says that oftentimes they can mandate permanent donation. Like, come on, like, what is this idealism, right? They seem to believe that this government, with all of the bad lobbying incentives, will suddenly say, I will lock this one really, really good company at development and ensure that I will permanently make them develop for me. So this is something that is not proven on their side. Finally, they say, you have UNICEF workers which are very smart. Like, come on, these are different kinds of workers, right? You need the technical expertise to develop this ed tech product as opposed to managing a broad kind of UNICEF. But to the extent that the claim is about UNICEF being a global actor, on our side, the big private equity firms are also global actor. Are they telling me that UNICEF has more money than Blackstone, which invests in all different kinds of fields? Just really, really bad mitigation on their side. But I want to be very charitable here. Even if these forms of ability exist, they have not responded to our central argument at the top, which is that these are all curtailed by government inefficiencies by design. The government is plagued by the problem of lobbying they identify. The government, with bloated bureaucracies, can never oftentimes manage it in an efficient way like a startup. Because of lots of hierarchies, for example, often it's very hard for the good, actually natured, altruistic worker at the bottom to communicate these ideas to the top. So it's actually on their side where the government as a big structure itself curtails all of these small ability stuff that they have. Second part of this clash, in terms of the incentive to innovate, I want to point out that they dropped the material about parties being long-termists in second and only revive it in third. Why doesn't it work? Because it's hung on so many things. The first link they haven't proven is why education is a unique way for you to build your legacy. If you want to cater to a poor voting base, might I suggest that the government would ensure that they increase taxes to increase welfare spending in so many other areas. Second, education is not a unique thing you can build a legacy on because it is uniquely a bipartisan issue. Why can't you build a legacy on a bipartisan issue? Because this bipartisan issue means that the wins from this issue oftentimes accrue to another party. Critically, the deadlock breaker here is in terms of a first mover disadvantage. On a bipartisan issue, you don't want to act first because the benefits of you winning that bipartisan issue goes to both parties, which is why on their side of the house, there's zero incentive for you to critically innovate. But here are more deadlock breakers. I just don't think that education is a main voting issue at all. Oftentimes, even if you care about education, you don't want to invest specifically in ed tech because ed tech is a speculative, risky field as opposed to general things about education like increasing teachers' pay, for example. And even if you do care about ed tech, the majority group they want to talk about specifically cares about ed tech that caters to their needs. It is not about special needs children. It is not about ensuring that you get specific kinds of lesson teaching that is better innovation on our side. But what is the final weighing at the end of this clash? Why is ability more important than incentive? The first thing I want to observe is in terms of exclusivity. We think that it is only when companies develop by themselves and they don't have to tether themselves towards government that they are willing to sink all of their money into this. In their best case, where you get public-private partnerships, which I want to point out is probably crossing the house, but to be charitable, I can accept. These are often instances where companies are deeply skeptical of government ability. The comparative on our side is that the worst accesses of bad incentives are ultimately curtailed, regardless of whether or not the PE firm is investing in ed tech. All governments with good incentives want to curtail PE firms because it is a large company that oftentimes voters feel scared about. So they have not proven exclusivity in terms of their way, in terms of incentive. I want to be critical here because this is their only path to victory. Recall what the strategy of their case is at the top. They give me 5 assertions about why incentive is the most important. They cannot drop this again in reply. So I want to point out that in terms of whether you have better quality products, we already cleanly win. Second clash then in terms of access. And I want to be very clear about the things that they dropped in this debate. But before I move on, sure.
UNICEF doesn't have more money than Blackstone, but that is precisely because they don't care about money, they care about catering to the kids that they are dedicated to, that their literal value and mission statement is about.
Okay, let's be clear. UNICEF has less money. What is the result of that? You have no money to develop the product. On our side, yes, it's the case that companies don't say, I want to develop the product because I care about kids. They say, I want to develop the product because I have more profits. What gets better profits? Better products for better kids in more diverse needs. So it's on our side of the house where you get better benefits. But let's look at the specific mechanisms they give in terms of access. They just broadly respond to our price discrimination mechanism by seemingly making the racist assumption that poor individuals can't purchase all of these products. Even if I accept this, I want to observe the framing that we gave, which is that private investors that engage in equity investments oftentimes specifically invest in the risky kinds of fields because there's a greater return on investment, right? We're going to a relatively undeveloped area in order for you to get this kind of investment. But I want to be very clear about how all of that analysis as to why governments have good incentives means that under our side of the house, governments could similarly subsidize this in a relatively good way. I want to be very clear about what the implications of access are on our side. Even if you don't buy this, what are further deadlock breakers? The first deadlock breaker is in terms of logical priority. If you accept that in general, governments could still fund these products but have less money than private companies, what you need to adjudicate is ensuring long-term funding. You only get long-term funding where you can develop these products in the first place. Often, lots of parents who deeply care about education are skeptical of edtech because it is seen as this new thing that is not traditional, right? You hear Asian parents saying that, why can't you just let these teachers teach these students in a traditional way? It is critically on our side when basic technologies already exist, they will increase investor willingness from the massive taxpayer population. The second is in terms of exclusivity. It is under our side of the house where you get access for the more important kinds of things. Are they seriously telling me that a more equitably developed edtech matters for the poorer schools that have crumbling infrastructure, that can't even afford to install Wi-Fi systems? These are the things that governments could free up education budget for if you accept that on both sides of the house there's an incentive for you to care about education. But finally, the last piece of weighing that was never responded to is in terms of vulnerability. Under our side of the house, there are already lots of other edtech services for normal kinds of students. The unique deadlock breaker is in terms of special needs students, which requires you pushing the frontier of innovation under our side. For all of these reasons, you must oppose.
Thanks so much. Awkward time.
The obvious issue with third proposition is she says frankly a lot of words, but a lot of words that she says actually falls to us. For instance, her preamble. The reason why her preamble falls to us is because if edtech is already developed at this stage, we should actually prefer venture-backed models. The structural reason is that there are already many other alternatives that governments have that therefore means that they don't need to fund and increase development of edtech on their side of the house. So their side is the side that forces governments to spend more than they need if edtech is already developed. Comparatively, on our side, you only pay companies when they come up with an even more revolutionary piece of technology, meaning that we actually increase the amount of funds to help poorer schools, which was their biggest winning claim in first, that was lost by the end of third. I want to walk you through the world of the proposition first. The first premise of the proposition was new in Prop 3, where she said you don't actually need smart people to innovate this. This was obviously a contradiction, because first prop and second prop said, UNICEF have the big and bulbous brain people because all of these people are very altruistic. Obviously, an aid worker is different from a guy going to Microsoft, and I don't think I need to belabor that point. But second, this is rocket science, guys. Like, have you gone for computer science class in school? You need to know how to create tailored learning algorithms. You need to know how to properly generate questions for you to get the proper algorithm coding. You need large-scale data servers, and these are really expensive things. So don't let that foolish rhetoric of saying this is not rocket science let them get away in this debate. So we prove that experts are important by their own analysis in first and second. Therefore, the clearest impact is this. We get more experts because companies can pay experts more money. More money means smarter brains. Smarter brains equal better development of platform. Second premise of their world was that they have the money to hire these experts on their side. The most laughable thing I've heard in the debate about donations is you can lock in the donations for 1 year permanently. Here's a newsflash, guys. If you lock in donations and make someone sign a contract where they promise to donate permanently for 1 year, no one is going to sign that. You know why? Because you fear that one day you could be sacked and suddenly you don't have money to donate. So it is false to say that you can lock in donations permanently for 1 year. But even if, on their very best case, this new claim in third works and you can lock in donations for some reason for a year, the point is that not a lot of people want to donate because people would rather keep the money for their own children, so people don't actually donate to UNICEF on their side. So their catchphrase of saying the UNICEF works is obviously false. The final premise of their case was that access is exclusive in their side, and the reason they give us is they say the poor have voting power. Correct, that also falls to us because that means the poor forms a very substantial chunk of the population, so companies want to price discriminate for them because they can gain profits from selling to the poor. Crucially, we also can mandate collaboration to ensure we get more competition. It is not a contradiction because mandating collaboration means that each company starts on a greater equal foot. That means we get more competition on our side of the house. So knowledge transfer exists on our side, and that also bolsters our mechanism of competition. Let's move into the world of the opposition then. The first thing that we pointed out that they refused to respond to was that governments, UNICEF, all of these foundations, unfortunately, are really trapped down by huge bureaucracies. So they can't create better technology because there are many different layers of approval you need to go through. And that was the most important mechanism they refused to respond to. But second, that this technology won't actually be developed on their side because education isn't a main voting issue. Your parents, Mexico, probably vote not just on education, but on healthcare for themselves or economy for themselves. So they don't only vote on education, so this thing is not developed in your world. Third, here's the reason why you should vote for us at the end of this debate. On our very worst case, we get more risk-taking on our side to get good innovation because companies have the extra funds to do risk-taking. Parties don't want to do this because they don't want to be remembered as the party that tried to cater to special needs kids, but then messed up after that. On the poor, there are many other ways you can subsidize these things for the poor. You can price discriminate, but they don't get catering to special needs kids because these people are a small voter base. This is the group that we protect, and that is why we oppose.
Thanks so much. Dr. Fine.
Harry Potter didn't wave a wand, and this was never a fantasy debate. We told you their platforms are useless, and no matter how many mechanisms they give you on the economy, there was never a response to our crux of the case on how our platforms educate children the best. We asked to have more quality and quantity for the education of these kids, and that this was the crux of the debate. This was never an economy debate. Firstly, I want to talk about our first path to the ballot on how we have quality of information in these platforms versus the design and interactions opposition platforms specialize in. The material you hear from our side is that we have professional university professors and the most educated actors to help design our edtech platforms. But they say this is impossible. False. The math is super simple, but it seems like they take super slowly to understand it. It was one, the requirements for being in education sector is having workers adhere to sufficient knowledge to work there. You can't let them get away with the only educated workers workers who are best skilled are driven by money. And even if that were true, for reasons that came out of the ether, at least at the worst case, we have workers in these platforms who at least fulfill the work environments and the sufficient requirements for them to work. But secondly, ironically, Team Singapore doesn't seem to comprehend that people are genuine and authentic enough to prioritize students and their academic futures. Because yes, some people are driven by money, but their whole bulk push on theirs is so obviously superficial. Firstly, people who work for large companies like UNICEF are paid well, even if it isn't in the private sectors. And secondly, schools, universities, and NGOs are as big as you see today, panel, because they were created from the incentive of making society's quality of life better and prioritize their future leaders and making good public goods for society. We are not wizards. We never made any kind of magic to make these claims because they were empirically true. So I don't understand why they were giggling so much about this. What is unlaughable here, panel, is them not telling you how their students are better educated on their side of the house. They try to overwhelm you with econ analysis, but will always miss the nail to the hammer on our case. You need to punish them for this, because no matter how much economy and non-practical benefits they unlock, this debate was about where students were better off, and their response to In Your Flow was simply unresponded and nowhere to be found. They didn't do this because they know that Class Dojo doesn't go beyond cool math games. Take away and do not let the rhetoric fool you, because the government obviously has, for example, departments of education with people who are at least majored in computer science and power. And obviously, there's no difference between putting a bunch of Zoom classes together and giving it a brand name and naming it rocket science. Second thing I want to tell you, you can still tell a team it's desperate when they bring new reputation in the reply speech. Because firstly, both sides concede development exists. However, the development is not equal to access. But why is this true? Because the platforms are expensive because they cater to the private school kids. But secondly, corporations gain profit from the poor, and therefore this is very intuitive for you, panel, because then those votes are exclusive, and therefore and therefore the incentives do not align with what they tell you. The impact on our side that we told you through the bench are simple. We have the type of development that is the best for these students. The tech on our side is developed by experts in children and cater to children. We told you this looked like development catered to the national curriculum and focused on areas that governments and NGOs know were underperforming. And we already have this information through state exams and actually finally having a sufficient platform to keep track of students at a national level. And we want to help those kids in the first place. Comparatively, venture-backed models that pursue bad subscriptions are obviously not going to cater to the accessibility that they want to give you, and they have to bite the bullet on it. But let's say that all their information is true. This is all inherently bad in their case, because at the end of the day, they're prioritizing money and the economy from what they tell you in their speeches instead of prioritizing the students. Because as long as we have that incentive to care for the students, then that is what's most important for the debate, and those are the vulnerable groups that we care for. Thank you, and see you in quarterfinals.